Taoiseach, I see this problem of the Anglo-Promissory notes as symptomatic of something possibly even more fundamental, because when Commissioner Ren was asked yesterday about the promissory notes, he embarked upon a kind of lecture to us and the rest of Europe about our obligations. And I think the Taoiseach should first of all tell Commissioner Ren that we're not given to taking lectures from him. When he said each and every member state respects the commitment it has undertaken, and this is valid in the case of Ireland as well. He went on to tick us off in Latin, no less, about our obligations. Now, before he breaks into Latin, I suggest he should brush up on his Greek, because Greece was the first exception to the rule that he was making yesterday. Spanish was the second exception to the rule that he was making yesterday, and that was only yesterday that Spain was given leeway on its budget deficit. And the danger I see here is this, that when we're entering the Fiscal Treaty, we're entering into a kind of a la carte Europe, where the big countries and the malingerers are being allowed to pick and choose where they're going to breach the treaty and where they're going to be made exceptions of. But where Ireland and Hungary, indeed, are going to be at the poor man's table, at the table d'hôte table. And they're not going to be able to do that. We're going to do what we're told by Olli Rehn. And I think it was patronising of Commissioner Ren to speak to Ireland in that way yesterday, after what you have done. You are the most compliant Taoiseach, the most compliant leader in Europe. And I don't think you should take it from him.
Question, please. Thank you.
Is Commissioner Ren privy to these negotiations? Does he know what's going on? Or is he just giving a kind of general overall lecture to yourself and other members of the European community on our long-term obligations?
Thank you.
I'd say you're probably one of the most erratic economists I've ever come across yourself. Clearly, Spain has to comply with the 3% by the end of next year. Ireland was given an extra year from the end of 2014 to the end of 2015. Yes, Commissioner Ren was speaking in regard to Hungary and Spain and Greece. And the Commissioner holds the same status as every other Commissioner, and our own Commissioner, Commissioner Quinn, represents the Commission at the same level. But these negotiations, Deputy Ross, are being conducted by the Troika, and I don't know whether all of the Commissioners know all of the details of all of the discussions that are taking place there. But you've mentioned Latin, and you've mentioned Greek, and you've mentioned Spanish. Always remember, Deputy Ross, that the old Gaelic tongue, in ancient times, was one of the prime languages of Europe. And there's an old saying in there that's very important for everybody to remember, and that is that when negotiations are underway, it's been bail in a hust.
Thank you. Deputy Ross, please. Thank you.
You've been very successful. You've been very successful in doing that this morning already. And I congratulate you on practicing what you preach, because nobody answers less questions in this House than you do. You have succeeded this morning, in giving no answers.
Thank you.
In giving no answers to any of the questions asked. The question specifically, Taoiseach, may I ask, is this. On the promissory notes, do you stand behind the statements made by two of your ministers, A, that they were very relevant on the referendum, and secondly, that there would be delivery on the promissory notes made by a Labour minister by the 31st of March? Are you now backsliding on that? And at what date are we to expect some result? It is true. I read into the record of this House what he said
Deputy,
to the Wall Street Journal, and you can read it
Deputy,
yourself.
through the chair, please. Thank you.
Sorry, Ken Collar. I read onto the record of this House what the Minister said on that particular issue, and he said that there will be delivery by the 31st of March. That was what he said specifically, and you can go and read that record yourself if you want to, and if you weren't here, that's not my problem. Now, Taoiseach, could you tell us whether the Cabinet is in line about this 31st of March deadline? Because it is very important, because the nation is watching to see if you deliver before that date on some alleviation of the debt or some alleviation of the promissory notes.
Thank you.
Well, I read what you said about Anglo-Irish Bank on many occasions, of course. Now, let me say something to Deputy Ross. I speak for the government here. The government have never set a deadline. The government have never raised expectations. The government are involved through the personnel, both at official level and from the independence of the central banks, with the IMF, the ECB and the Commission in regard to the negotiations arising from the initiative of the Troika. So, be clear on this, no intention of raising any expectations. There was never a timeline set by government on this. I understand these negotiations are ongoing. They are complex, they are technical, and for me as head of government, I expect that the personnel on all sides who are involved in these discussions and negotiations should be allowed to do their job without interference. That is their remit and their responsibility. So there it is. No timeline, no expectations, but an understanding that Ireland wants to be involved in bringing about a situation where the paper to be produced by the Troika, if we can get a conclusion in respect of flexibility for our country here, would be of benefit to us. And in that regard, these discussions and negotiations continue. So please understand that as head of government, we're not raising expectations, we're not forcing time limits, so your comments in that regard are irrelevant.
Thank you. That completes leaders' questions for today. We now move on to the order of business.